The Monday meeting had all the warmth of fluorescent lighting and recycled air. Faces appeared one after another on the screen, framed by carefully blurred backgrounds and polite corporate smiles that never quite reached anyone's eyes. Coffee mugs steamed, notification sounds chimed. Somewhere, a keyboard clicked with unnecessary confidence. Emma joined exactly on time. Not early enough to impress anyone, not late enough to apologize, just on time. For 3 years, she had been the quiet constant behind projects everyone else proudly presented. She had coordinated impossible schedules across 4 time zones, untangled compliance reports before sunrise, and answered late-night messages with the calm precision of someone who believed that good work eventually spoke for itself. It usually did, until it didn't. The HR manager adjusted her headset before speaking, the practiced smile already fixed in place. "We've reviewed the concerns regarding your remote arrangement." A pause. Another glance toward someone sitting off camera. "We believe the current situation is no longer sustainable." The words floated through the meeting like tiny shards of glass. Emma waited. No interruption, no defensive speech, no desperate explanation. Across the screen, several teammates lowered their eyes. One suddenly became fascinated by handwritten notes. Another pretended to check a calendar that clearly wasn't open 5 seconds earlier. Silence often reveals more than conversation ever can. The HR manager folded her hands. "Nobody is obligated to tolerate your remote work." The sentence landed with the cold certainty of a stamp hitting paper. For a brief second, even the office air seemed to stop moving. Emma looked through the window beside her desk. Outside, rain painted silver lines across the city skyline. The rooftops shimmered beneath heavy clouds, turning the afternoon into something almost cinematic. Strange how ordinary weather could feel beautiful exactly when people disappointed you. She inhaled slowly. Understood. Nothing else. No argument. That seemed to confuse everyone far more than resistance would have. One executive leaned forward. "Is that all?" Emma offered the smallest smile. "I appreciate the opportunity we've had together." Someone cleared their throat. Someone else muted themselves. The meeting suddenly felt much larger than the tiny boxes on the screen. Because nobody expected dignity. They had prepared themselves for emotion. Instead, they received professionalism. And professionalism can be deeply unsettling when someone hopes for a scene. She thanked the project coordinators individually. She wished the operations team success on the upcoming quarter. She even congratulated a junior analyst on a recent promotion everyone else had forgotten to mention. Every sentence sounded genuine, which somehow made the room even quieter. Only one person kept watching carefully. The company's legal counsel representative had joined the meeting halfway through without saying a word. His camera stayed off. His microphone remained muted. Most people barely noticed his name in the participant list. Emma certainly did. Not because it worried her, simply because legal almost never attended HR conversations unless paperwork mattered. That tiny detail lingered in the back of her mind like a faint echo. Something didn't quite fit. She signed the exit documentation electronically, closed the company portal, disabled notifications. Then she stood from her desk and stretched. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the horizon. Inside her apartment, everything remained strangely peaceful. No dramatic music, no shattered coffee mug, no tears, only silence. The kind of silence that comes after accepting something, long before everyone else realizes it has happened. Her phone vibrated once. A message from an old colleague. "Are you okay?" Emma smiled before typing. "Better than you probably think." She placed the phone face down. The bookshelf beside her held binders from years of consulting work, color-coded with almost obsessive precision. Every folder represented late nights, impossible deadlines, forgotten weekends, and promises delivered despite shrinking budgets. People remembered presentations. They rarely remembered who prevented disasters before they existed. Emma did, because prevention had always been her real job. As evening settled over the city, golden reflections stretched across wet streets below. Cars drifted through puddles like quiet ships crossing dark water. Somewhere nearby, laughter spilled from a cafe patio untouched by office politics. Life moved forward without asking permission. She brewed fresh tea instead of replaying the meeting in her head. That surprised even her. Perhaps because disappointment loses much of its power once it finally arrives. The anticipation had been heavier than the outcome. Still, one question refused to disappear. Why had legal joined? The company had presented the decision as routine. Routine decisions rarely attracted counsel, especially not during budget season, especially not while everyone seemed oddly nervous whenever contracts were mentioned. Emma opened a notebook she hadn't touched in months. Inside were personal reminders rather than confidential documents. Dates, project milestones, major approvals, names of executive sponsors. Nothing sensitive, nothing inappropriate. Just the timeline she had always maintained for herself. Her eyes stopped on one handwritten entry. The ink had faded slightly. Executive Audit Agreement finalized. She remembered the week instantly. 3 consecutive 18-hour days. Emergency negotiations. Vendor revisions arriving minutes before deadlines. A contract so complicated that half the leadership team avoided reading it altogether. She closed the notebook. No. There was no point revisiting old work. That chapter belonged to the company now. Or so she believed. Far across town, lights still glowed on the executive floor long after sunset. Printers continued humming. Assistants hurried between offices. Someone requested archived documentation. Someone else searched shared drives twice. Nobody explained why. Nobody volunteered answers. But the building no longer carried the relaxed rhythm of an ordinary Monday. It carried the quiet pressure that appears only when people begin wondering whether they overlooked something important. And once that question enters a boardroom, it almost never leaves. If you think the meeting ended with her resignation, you're looking at the wrong moment. The real story had only begun to move, and by the time anyone noticed, the first irreversible decision had already been made. 48 hours can pass quietly, or they can unravel months of certainty without making a sound. By Wednesday morning, the executive floor looked exactly as it always had. The glass walls reflected pale sunlight, espresso machines hummed in the corner, assistants hurried through hallways carrying tablets and neatly organized folders. To anyone walking in from outside, it was another ordinary business day. It wasn't. At 8:17 a.m., an email marked "Urgent" landed in the inbox of the company's counsel. The subject line was painfully ordinary: Audit Documentation Review. No flashing warnings, no dramatic wording, just another item in an already crowded morning. He opened it while taking his first sip of coffee. Attached were the final documents for an external audit tied to a $4.2 million contract that was scheduled to begin the following week. The auditors had requested confirmation that every required approval remained valid after recent organizational changes. Routine, until it wasn't. He skimmed the signature page, then stopped. His coffee remained untouched. He leaned closer to the monitor. There it was, Emma's signature. Not decorative, not administrative, authorizing. The legal authority assigned to that section wasn't symbolic. Months earlier, leadership had delegated specific approval responsibilities to her because she had coordinated the compliance process from beginning to end. Removing her from the company had solved one problem in HR's eyes. Legally, it had quietly created another. He opened the delegation records. Still active. He refreshed the page. Still active. That wasn't supposed to happen. Within minutes, another attorney joined his office. Tell me I'm reading this wrong. You aren't. Silence settled between them like dust in an abandoned room. The first attorney closed the file. Who approved her separation before checking active authorizations? Neither of them answered, because neither wanted to guess. Across the hallway, the chief financial officer was discussing quarterly forecasts when his assistant interrupted with an apology rarely heard inside executive meetings. I'm sorry, but legal says they need you immediately. The room grew still. Budget discussions stopped. Someone muted the presentation screen. That almost never happened. Inside the conference room, printed contracts were already spread across the table. Colored tabs marked critical clauses. One page remained isolated from the others, the signature page. The counsel spoke first. We have an issue. The CFO frowned. What kind of issue? A governance issue. Those two words changed the atmosphere instantly. Numbers could be negotiated. Governance could not. The HR director arrived a few minutes later, carrying the confidence of someone expecting a procedural conversation. That confidence faded before she even sat down. The counsel slid the document across the table. She glanced at it. Nothing. Another page. Still nothing. Then the signature. Emma's name. Her expression froze. I thought this project had already transferred. It didn't. I was told operations. You were told incorrectly. No accusation, no raised voices. The calmness in the room made everything worse. Professional disappointment has a peculiar sound. It isn't loud, it's measured. Every sentence becomes shorter, every pause becomes longer. The counsel folded his hands. The audit begins next week. The CFO nodded. I know. We no longer have the authorized signatory who certified the compliance package. Another silence. Longer this time. Someone tapped a pen exactly once before realizing how loud it sounded. The HR director finally spoke. Can we appoint someone else? The attorney answered almost immediately. Not retroactively. That single word seemed to remove all oxygen from the room. Retroactively. The kind of word executives never want to hear, especially when millions of dollars sit on the other side of the table. The CFO stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown traffic. Cars streamed through intersections with perfect indifference to corporate mistakes unfolding 30 floors above them. He spoke without turning around. What are our options? The counsel didn't hesitate. Delay the audit. Consequences? Contractual. Alternative? Reverse the employment decision before the auditors request formal confirmation. No one moved. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the skyline. Inside, time felt strangely compressed. The HR director stared at the contract as though another answer might suddenly appear between the printed lines. It didn't. She remembered Emma's final words. I wish the team good luck. At the time, they had sounded graceful. Now they sounded almost haunting. Not because Emma had planned anything, because she hadn't. She had simply completed her work thoroughly enough that the company still depended on it after showing her the door. That realization was infinitely harder to accept than any act of revenge could have been. No sabotage, no hidden trap, only competence. And competence leaves a very long shadow. The counsel closed the folder. His voice remained steady. My recommendation is simple. Everyone looked up. We reverse the decision. No dramatic emphasis, no emotional appeal, just legal advice. For several seconds, nobody responded. Not the CFO, not HR, not operations. Only the quiet ventilation system filled the room. Silence. The kind that arrives when every person realizes the cost of a careless decision cannot be measured only in dollars. Before anyone reached for a phone, one uncomfortable thought crossed the table without being spoken aloud. What if Emma had already moved on? By the time they finally decided who should make the call, the answer to that question mattered more than the $4.2 million contract itself. And some opportunities don't wait for a second invitation. If Emma's calm exit gave you chills, stay with the story. The real power move wasn't revenge, it was documentation. The phone remained silent for most of the afternoon, and for the first time in years, Emma didn't mind. She had traded the endless rhythm of meetings, notifications, and urgent emails for the quiet hum of a neighborhood cafe where sunlight spilled across wooden tables and the smell of fresh coffee blended with the soft rustle of turning pages. A novel lay open in front of her, one she had bought months ago but never had time to read. It felt strange to enjoy an afternoon without watching the clock. When an unknown number appeared on her screen, she simply let it ring. A second call followed a few minutes later, then a voicemail notification. She slipped the phone back into her bag. If it truly mattered, whoever was calling would explain why. That had always been her rule. Ironically, it was a rule the company had rarely respected. At headquarters, however, calm had completely disappeared. The executive conference room had turned into an improvised command center where laptops stayed open, coffee grew cold, and every discussion eventually circled back to the same question. Has anyone reached her? The answers never changed. Calls went unanswered, emails were delivered but unread. Text messages sat without a reply. For years, everyone had taken Emma's responsiveness for granted. She always answered within minutes, solved problems before they became meetings, and quietly connected departments that barely communicated with one another. Only now, in her absence, did they realize that what they had called efficiency had often been Emma herself. The company's counsel reviewed the $4.2 million contract once again, following every approval with careful attention. The deeper he looked, the more obvious the picture became. Emma's signature wasn't valuable because it appeared on a page. It mattered because every critical compliance decision leading to that signature had passed through her judgment. She hadn't simply managed documents. She had designed the process that allowed the company to satisfy regulators, auditors, and clients without delays. Replacing an employee was possible. Replacing years of accumulated knowledge hidden inside routines no one else understood was something entirely different. Looking around the room, he finally said, "We've been measuring the wrong role." No one argued. The CFO slowly opened several archived project folders, and Emma's name appeared again and again. Not as the presenter or department head, but as the person who had quietly resolved risks before anyone else even noticed them. She had become the bridge between teams without ever asking to be recognized. Bridges are almost invisible while they're standing. People only notice them after they're gone. Meanwhile, Emma wandered into a small bookstore as rain softly tapped against the windows. The atmosphere felt peaceful, almost unreal compared to the tension unfolding across town. She smiled while browsing books on leadership and organizational psychology. Not because she missed corporate life, but because she finally had time to learn for herself instead of immediately applying every lesson to someone else's deadline. Her phone vibrated once more. This time she listened to the voicemail. Daniel from counsel spoke calmly, explaining that there was a legal matter regarding the audit documentation and asking if she would be willing to return his call. There was no pressure in his voice, no attempt to persuade her, only quiet professionalism. Emma replayed the message once before locking her phone again. She wasn't ignoring him out of resentment. She simply realized that she no longer had to interrupt her day every time the company encountered an emergency. Back at the office, the atmosphere had shifted from frustration to reflection. The HR director looked around the room before speaking. "I think we judged visibility instead of value," she admitted. We treated remote work as a problem and never stopped to ask whether the results justified the flexibility. The confession hung in the room. Nobody rushed to defend the earlier decision, because the evidence was spread across the conference table. Every report, every approval chain, every page of the contract pointed toward the same conclusion. They had mistaken quiet competence for replaceability. The CFO rested his hand on the $4.2 million contract and understood that the real risk had never been one signature. It was losing the person whose judgment held the entire process together. Late that evening, Daniel received a reply. It contained only a single sentence. "I'm available tomorrow between 10 o'clock and 10:30 if there's a legitimate legal matter to discuss." He read it twice before quietly closing his laptop. It wasn't an acceptance, and it certainly wasn't forgiveness. It was simply the response of someone who still valued professionalism, even after the company had failed to value hers. Tomorrow's meeting would begin with a conversation no policy manual could script. And for the first time that week, the executives understood that listening might be the most important thing they had left to do. Emma arrived at the downtown office at exactly 10 a.m. the next morning. She wore the same calm expression she had carried into every difficult meeting over the past 3 years, except this time she wasn't carrying a company laptop or an access badge. She signed in as a visitor, accepted the temporary pass from reception with a polite smile, and followed an assistant toward the executive floor. Nothing about her posture suggested anger, triumph, or anxiety. She looked like someone attending an ordinary business meeting, while inside the building nearly everyone understood it was anything but ordinary. Conversations stopped as she walked past glass conference rooms. People who had barely acknowledged her for years suddenly found reasons to step into the hallway. Some offered awkward smiles. Others quietly looked away, embarrassed by how quickly circumstances had changed. Daniel from council greeted her personally outside the conference room. "Thank you for coming," he said. Emma simply nodded. "You mentioned there was a legal matter." He appreciated that she went straight to the point. "There is. We'd like to clarify the status of the audit documentation and discuss the authorization attached to the $4.2 million contract." She took her seat without rushing, placing a small notebook on the table. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to make anyone uncomfortable. The silence in the room came entirely from the executives who remembered the confidence with which they had approved her dismissal less than 3 days earlier. The CFO entered a moment later, followed by the HR director. Unlike their previous meeting, nobody opened with prepared statements or corporate slogans. The HR director was the first to speak. "Emma, before we discuss the contract, I owe you an apology. We evaluated your work through the lens of where you worked instead of what you consistently delivered." Emma listened without interrupting. She didn't soften the moment by saying it was fine, because it wasn't. Nor did she make it harder than necessary. She simply replied, "I appreciate you saying that." It was enough to keep the conversation moving, but not enough to erase what had happened. Daniel slid several documents across the table. "Our review confirmed that your delegated authority remains connected to the audit package. The external auditors requested confirmation yesterday, and we realized too late how much of the compliance framework depended on your oversight." Emma looked through the pages carefully before answering. "The framework wasn't designed around me," she said calmly. "It was designed around accountability. If one person leaving creates this much uncertainty, the process itself needs improvement." The room fell quiet again. No one could disagree. She wasn't criticizing anyone personally. She was describing a structural weakness they had failed to notice because everything had worked while she was there. The CFO leaned forward. "We're prepared to reverse our previous decision if you're willing to return." The offer remained hanging between them. Emma didn't answer immediately. She looked through the conference room window toward the skyline shimmering under the afternoon sun. Only a few days earlier, she had believed losing this job would feel like losing stability. Instead, those 48 hours had reminded her something important. Stability had never come from the company. It had come from her own experience, discipline, and reputation. That realization changed everything. "I appreciate the offer," she finally said. "But before I consider any decision, I'd need to understand what exactly would be different." Nobody expected that question, yet it was the only one that mattered. Returning to the same environment under a different headline would solve nothing. The HR director admitted they had already begun reviewing their remote work policy, delegation procedures, and performance evaluation standards. Daniel added that council intended to recommend clearer governance rules so critical responsibilities could never again depend on assumptions instead of documented authority. Emma listened carefully. For the first time since entering the building, she sensed genuine reflection instead of damage control. The meeting ended without a final answer. Emma stood, thanked everyone for their honesty, and collected her notebook. As she walked toward the elevator, several employees quietly greeted her, no longer out of obligation, but with visible respect. The atmosphere in the building felt different now, not lighter, more honest. People had witnessed how quickly confidence could become humility when competence disappeared. Emma stepped into the elevator, and just before the doors closed, her phone vibrated with a new email notification. It wasn't from her former employer. It was from another company, asking whether she would be available to discuss a senior consulting opportunity. She looked at the subject line, smiled almost imperceptibly, and slipped the phone back into her pocket without opening it. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't chasing opportunity. Opportunity had started looking for her. Emma didn't respond to the new email until the following morning. There was no strategy behind the delay, no attempt to create suspense. She simply wanted to make one decision at a time. By now, that felt like a luxury. She sat on her balcony with a cup of coffee as the city slowly came to life below her. Morning sunlight reflected off rows of office windows where another workday was beginning, and for the first time in years, she wasn't rushing to be part of it. She opened the message. The consulting firm had followed her work during the multi-company audit and wanted to meet. Not because she had become the center of an office controversy, but because clients had consistently mentioned one thing in their feedback. When Emma was involved, projects stayed on track. At the same time, the company she had left was holding another executive meeting. This one felt very different from the previous week's discussions. There was no search for someone to blame, and no attempt to rewrite what had happened. Instead, the agenda focused on systems, accountability, and trust. The HR director presented a revised remote work policy built around measurable results rather than physical presence. Council introduced new governance procedures, ensuring that critical authorizations tied to every major contract would always be reviewed before personnel decisions were finalized. The $4.2 million contract remained on the screen as a reminder not of a legal crisis, but of an expensive lesson. The CFO looked around the room and said quietly, "If we only change the paperwork, we'll repeat the mistake. We have to change how we recognize value." A week later, the external auditors completed their review without issue. The necessary documentation had been updated correctly, every authorization had been confirmed, and the project moved forward. No headlines appeared, no dramatic announcement celebrated the outcome. That was fitting. The people who prevent problems rarely receive applause when everything works as it should. Emma appreciated that more than anyone. She eventually met with the consulting firm in a bright office overlooking the river. The conversation was refreshingly simple. Nobody asked how many hours she preferred to spend at a desk. Nobody questioned whether working remotely demonstrated commitment. They asked how she approached risk, how she built reliable processes, and how she helped teams avoid costly mistakes before they happened. It was the kind of interview that left her energized instead of exhausted. Walking back outside, she realized she had spent years trying to prove her dedication in the wrong room. Several days later, Daniel from council sent one final email. It wasn't another request or negotiation. It simply thanked her for handling every conversation with professionalism and wished her success wherever she chose to go next. Emma smiled before replying with a single sentence. I hope the company remembers that trust is easier to protect than to rebuild. She pressed send and closed her laptop. Sometimes people think the loudest voice wins. Sometimes they believe justice arrives through revenge or public humiliation. But real victories are often much quieter. They happen when the facts speak for themselves, when integrity survives disappointment, and when a person's reputation becomes stronger than any opinion formed in a single meeting. Emma never fought to embarrass anyone. She simply continued being the professional she had always been. In the end, the company corrected its decision, improved its policies, and learned that respect cannot be measured by office attendance or meeting visibility. As she walked toward her new future, the weight she had carried for years seemed to disappear with every step. The city looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed. Not because the world had become kinder, but because she finally understood something no performance review could ever measure. The right place never asks you to prove your worth by sacrificing your dignity. It recognizes your value long before it is forced to discover your absence.